One of President Donald Trump's top economic advisors was just quoted as saying this, quote, "I do not believe nowadays we have systemic racism in our society." Well, he's certainly entitled to his belief, but let's go over the historical facts and the historical evidence that disproves that statement and proves that systemic racism is absolutely a part of this society. And in fact, it's been entrenched in the American fabric since its inception. I think it's important to start at the beginning so that we can have a greater understanding of how racism was systematically built in this country. A lot of folks say, well, slavery was 400 years ago. Well, not really. It started 400 years ago in 1619, but it didn't end until 1865, which was over 247 years. When we were brought here, we lost our names, we lost our religion, we lost our language, and adopted the language, the religion, and the names of the slave master. And then over that 247-year period, centuries, black people were brainwashed into believing that they contributed nothing to the advancement of society, despite the fact that Africans influenced Roman culture, Greek culture, and were the first humans on this earth. They were put against one against the other, light-skinned blacks versus dark-skinned blacks. They were told that they were nothing, that they were less than human. And then after that thorough brainwashing over a 247-year period, the so-called Emancipation Proclamation occurred where we were supposedly freed. And isn't it interesting how systemic racism continued to evolve, because after we were supposedly freed, the slave owners received financial reparations from the United States. They were made whole for losing their chattel, their property that black people represented at that particular time in history. But the former slaves who built the country, who built the economic base, because remember, America was a poor country in its inception. It became wealthy because of the slave labor. Those former slaves received no reparations, no financial reparations, and perhaps more importantly, no mental or emotional repairing as well. Because over that 247-year period, trauma was constantly inflicted upon these former slaves, these black people in this country. And of course, trauma gets passed down. When you learn it, you teach it to your descendants as well. But black people received none of that. So you have millions of former slaves, highly skilled former slaves, who had no economic base, no land. So what did they have to resort back to? Essentially, slavery again, indentured servitude. But then systemic racism continued to evolve in this country. There was the 13th Amendment. It sounded great. It's abolishing slavery, but there was an exception. People could be enslaved if they were put in prison. And so then you had states all over this union enacting what were called vagrancy laws, essentially making it illegal for just being black. You could be out on the street corner and get arrested, put in prison, re-enslaved just because you're a black person. And this happened to hundreds of thousands of black people post the Emancipation Proclamation, re-enslaved in our prison system. And we'll talk more about that later on in this argument, because that still exists today. Systemic racism continued to evolve. There was a period in our country of great domestic terrorism against black people. Roughly, it started in the 1860s, but let's say 1860 to 1940, there were white mobs, there were police officers, there was the KKK, who was going all over this country terrorizing black people, again, just for being black. They were being lynched, they were being murdered. We've heard about the stories. Emmett Till, all over this country, being killed, being brutalized, being terrorized, simply for the fact that they existed as a black person in this country. Blacks continued to be subjected to second-class citizenship, no civil rights, not even human rights. They were treated less than human. And a good example I can give is in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. There was an area in Tulsa called Black Wall Street. This was an area where blacks had set up their own economic ecosystem, their own communities. They were doing extremely well financially, and in fact, they were doing better than a lot of the whites in surrounding towns. And that was starting to get around. And unfortunately, in 1921, a mob of white people came to that area called Black Wall Street, and they murdered hundreds of black people and bombed the entire community so that it no longer existed. They destroyed Black Wall Street in 1921 because of racism, which was pervasive, not only in Oklahoma, but all over the country. But this is something that most of us didn't learn about during school. It was almost like it was erased from our history. It was hidden from you, it was hidden from me. But it's a part of the American fabric. It's a part of our history. Racism and systemic racism in this country continued to evolve in 1945 after World War II, where blacks fought, they died, they shed their blood in World War II and in every war that this country has fought in. And there was a bill called the GI Bill that was created. And this was a great program for veterans who fought in World War II. They could come back to America and take advantage of the GI Bill, which essentially allowed them to get homes, get an economic base. Those blacks who came back home after fighting this war, came back to second-class citizenship, and also found that they couldn't take advantage of the GI Bill. They were being systematically excluded. Couldn't buy a home, couldn't get a loan. They couldn't take advantage of the federal housing program. Why? Because of systemic racism, because they were black. And that wealth gap continued to grow and grow and grow and grow. Let's go into the civil rights era in the 50s and the 60s. The evidence is clear. The majority of the black men and women who stood up to speak candidly about the injustices that they were being faced with, the masses of black people were being faced with, they were brutalized or they were killed. Medgar Evers, Malcolm X. And the best example I can give about pervasive racism in this particular time and how it evolved is Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King today is well respected, well beloved, much quoted in the news and by people all over this country. But what if I told you that back in the 60s, Dr. King was one of the most hated men or women in this entire country? He was hated by American people. And what if I told you that the evidence is clear that the United States government, our own government, the country that we love, was conspiring against Dr. King to try to undermine him, to try to make it so that he wouldn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, so that he couldn't meet the Pope, because they wanted to undermine his credibility. They knew that if he met with the Pope, that if he got the Nobel Peace Prize, that his credibility would skyrocket. And the United States government, under the FBI's COINTELPRO program, did this to try to undermine Dr. King. Why? Why? Dr. King broke no laws. He was only trying to enforce what was promised to black people, which is civil rights. But it was done because of systemic racism. Now, this wasn't overt, this wasn't obvious to the American public, but it evolved into this abstract concept. And the evidence is overwhelmingly clear that it was done because of what he was fighting for. And we all know the story. When he started to speak out against the war in Vietnam, he was assassinated. So we all know that drugs have devastated black communities in this country. They've taken fathers from homes and put them in prison because of drugs. They have ripped families apart completely. It's just absolutely been devastating. But what if I told you that the evidence is overwhelmingly clear that the United States government also played a role in devastating these black communities, and that it was intentional and that it was because of systemic racism. During the Nixon administration, there was a top advisor. His name was John Ehrlichman, and I may be mispronouncing his name, but he was caught on an audio recording admitting that the so-called war on drugs was really a farce. And he was quoted as saying the war on drugs was really a war against people who opposed the Vietnam War and against black people. He said, we knew we couldn't make it illegal to oppose the war. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be black. But if we devastated these communities, locked them up, getting them hooked on these drugs, we would devastate them and the effect would be exactly the same. Abstract, not overt, not clear cut, because the racism and the systemic racism evolved. So let's talk about the Reagan administration. We're getting closer and closer to the present. It's a man named Lee Atwater. He was a key Southern strategist in this administration. Again, caught on audio. He uses some very ugly words, but I'm going to use them. He says back in '54, you could just say nigger, nigger, nigger. But now if you were to do that, and this was in '68 that he said that, instead you start saying things like forced busing, states' rights. You get so abstract now, such as cutting taxes and all of these economic things, and the result is exactly the same. Blacks get hurt worse than whites. Why? Because of systemic racism. They didn't in any way want blacks to be equal to whites. And if they had to hide that through some economic policy to continue to push down and devastate blacks, that's what was done. That's what the evidence is. And it continued to evolve. There's gerrymandering, there's redlining, all of these abstract, complex things that have the same effect, the same outcome. So I want to kind of bring this all home as I get ready to wrap up and talk about law enforcement and how that plays a role in this systemic racism that is prevalent in our society. So back in 1998, there was a case in New Jersey. Johnny Cochran and his team actually represented 4 young minority men, 3 black men, 1 Hispanic. They were on their way from New Jersey to North Carolina to try out for North Carolina Central basketball team when they were stopped by the New Jersey patrol. They hadn't broken any laws, they weren't speeding, but they were stopped. And what later happened, really with no provocation at all, 3 out of 4 of these young men were shot. They were shot, they were taken out of the vehicle, they were handcuffed while they were still bleeding. The EMS was not called. The patrol officers searched the vehicle while they're bleeding on the ground, handcuffed, their hands behind their back, on their stomachs. They found nothing in the vehicle. And then after they searched the vehicle, then the paramedics were called. During the investigation of this case, the lawyers representing these young men learned that there was pervasive racism in the New Jersey State Patrol and pervasive racial profiling. And in fact, they learned of a black dentist who said from 1984 to 1988, while driving his gold BMW, he was stopped over 100 times on that passage, which they called white man's passage at that particular time, in a 4-year period, and did not receive 1 single citation. And they also learned that there were over 43,000 stops in a 3-year period of time, and blacks and Latinos were almost 5 times as likely to be stopped, but also less likely to have drug paraphernalia or guns than their white counterparts. Racial profiling that was systemic, and in fact, the officers began to cover things up. They would actually change on the police report the race of the person they were stopping so that it didn't look like they were profiling blacks and whites. But of course, that was uncovered and found not to be true. We still deal with this today in America. Blacks are more likely to be stopped. They're more likely to have police encounters, 2.8 times more likely to be killed by police than whites as well. They're the most over-policed in their communities. It still goes on today. We all know about George Floyd and all of these cases all over the country where black men are dying who are unarmed and shouldn't be killed. This is how systemic racism continues to evolve and how it continues to affect black people each and every day of our lives. Based on this evidence, this historical proof that systemic racism is not gone, it's just evolved. We know that about the lack of educational resources in minority communities, the lack of opportunities, the lack of access to health care as compared to white communities. It's crystal clear. But I want to also explain that racism is not just overt acts. It's not just saying a racial slur. It's not actively hating someone because of their color. It's microaggressions, it's stereotyping, it's profiling. And so my ask to anyone listening to this video is that this is not something that you can work on once a year. This is something that you have to call out each and every day that you see it, not just from other people, but if you notice yourself engaging in that. We have to continue to fight against it. Otherwise, this system will continue. It will continue to affect people of color, and it will continue to devastate all of us.